Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight, especially in this really dreary weather. Really appreciate it. This is Laura Reichsman. I was the program director of the Family Outreach of Amherst. As I think most everybody knows, and probably everybody could do a better introduction than I have. Excuse the mask. I have not been feeling well as the evening has progressed, so I figure I should take, even though I don't think it's anything, I'm just taking precautions. So. But we're really delighted to have Laura here today. She really embodies the Thursday evening series, which features remarkable and accomplished local women and their personal journey of challenges and achievements. And I think that says a lot. Laura was raised in Amherst, where she raised her son as well as a teen mother. This brought her a unique perspective on working with at-risk struggling families. Having to support her son and herself at a young age, she cobbled together an academic career and background in women's studies. But as Laura has said, the best training she had for guiding parents out of crisis and helping struggling families has been her own lived experience, not something that came out of a textbook. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what she has to say. She has been the director of the Family Outreach for 30 years, 30 plus years. 32, yeah. And basically we took it from a small program with like one caseworker to an agency that's, has 600 clients. Yeah. And what they provide is, as you probably know, a huge amount of services to struggling families and people in need in the town. So, Laura, you did a great job.
Hey, thank you. It's interesting because I think half of the crowd here tonight are on my board. So I didn't mean to pad the crowd. And when you talk about me creating this agency from something small into something bigger, raise your hand if you're on the board. Wow. Yeah. So that it wasn't. I didn't do it single-handedly. Every single one of these women that raised their hand has had a big part. And about more than 20 years ago, I had the good fortune of meeting Betsy McGinnis, who was really when it went from a small to what is now a huge, and harangues us all to make it better in the best way possible. So I can't hear that and not acknowledge. But thank you, Women's Club. Who's in the Women's Club? Raise your hand because I've got so many. All right, thank you for coming out on this dreary night. I mean, my goodness, it's or dreary afternoon really, but it is a rainy day. And thank you for asking me to speak tonight. I've been speaking about FOA for 32 years, and I am very comfortable doing that, but I must admit, talking about myself, my life, and it's like, no, don't make it about FOA, make it about your life, your journey. And that's a lot scarier. That's much more nerve-wracking, so please forgive me if I'm nervous. I moved to Amherst with my brothers and my mother when I was 10. My mother was fleeing a violent relationship that started when I was 8, when my parents divorced, and my mom left my dad for this man, who would make our lives a living hell for the next 6 years. If you do the math, you know that the fleeing to Amherst didn't work, and he was back in our lives and in the apartment we fled to soon after we moved. This started a pattern of living in a place for a few years, and then she'd move us out to get us away from him, and then he would follow very soon after. And finally, after our third such move, her abuser showed up when she was having a dinner party, witnesses, and he dragged her into another room, and for the first time in 6 years, someone called the police. It's almost unthinkable now that it had taken that long, but this was in 1976. and things were very different back then. I can't tell you how many times I have helped families in the very same situation, and thinking about my own childhood, thought, really? No one intervened? No one said anything? Neighbors, school personnel, even relatives, all stayed silent. When I think back on my childhood, the two words that come to mind are fearful and confusing. My life had been pretty uneventful before my parents split up, and the lives of myself and my brothers changed so completely, seemingly overnight, and the overriding emotion that I can remember of my childhood is shock and fear. I was pretty frightened all the time. The level just changed depending on what was happening at the moment, and I say moment because the mood in the house and the level of violence would change in a blink of an eye. So the good news is that when I was 14, the police were called, they took him away, we were free of him. He broke into the house once again, and that's a whole other story, but then he was gone. But the bad news is that my mom almost immediately became involved and then pregnant with a very lovely, gentle drug dealer. I don't know. You know those memoirs that are out there, some very good, that recount a dreadful childhood? The Glass Castle comes to mind. When I read it, I kept thinking, oh my goodness, that's outrageous. And then thinking, that couldn't have happened. And then caught myself at thinking, of course it could happen. Think about this and this and this and this crazy thing that happened in my childhood. And I don't think you'd be surprised to learn I didn't finish that book. I was like, I don't need that. I watch sports and cooking shows. That's all I'll watch. I can't, I have no interest in things that go bump in the night. I experienced it. The next 2 years of my life was marked with drugs and alcohol and a series of inappropriate people that were in and out of our house, some living there, all exposing us to stuff that young teens should not be exposed to. I don't have much of a relationship with my mom anymore. I talk to her maybe every couple months, but I have so much rage about her complete lack of ability to keep us safe in literally every situation. That that's all I can do. And that's that. When I was 16, I moved out of the house and into a small apartment on Main Street, just down the street. No violence, no parties, just peace. I often joke that I moved out because I couldn't take the sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And it was really true. I mean, this was the 70s, But I just wanted some normalcy in my life, right? Moving out was the best thing that had ever happened to me, and with my dad transferring his child support payments to me so I could pay my rent and working a full-time job as a waitress, I was finally safe and happy. I had a high school boyfriend who had a fairly normal family who I loved. Dan was my point of stability, although he had his own issues that came out later, much later, and it turned into a severe drug addiction that killed him when he was 59, which is sad for my son. But my 17-year-old self adored him, and I was devastated when he left the state 2 weeks after I told him I was pregnant. So I was like, God, kick her? You want to kick her again? Come on. I dropped out of high school soon after. I just couldn't handle a full-time job, school, deep, deep grief, and pregnancy. Something had to go, and school was it. I loved being a mom, but I kind of drifted. The title of this talk is From Client to Director, a Story of Resiliency. And while I wasn't a client of FOA because it didn't exist in 1979, I could have been one and would have benefited greatly from the ongoing in-depth support that we offer mothers just like I was. When I was 20, I was living with my son in Village Park Apartments on East Pleasant Street. I was working and going to community college, not at all sure what I wanted to do with my life. One night, my best friend, who also lived in the complex, knocked on my door. I opened it to find that she had been beaten up by her boyfriend. Her eyes were already swelling shut, she had a bloody lip and bruises everywhere. We stayed up all night, terrified he would come back. and find her. And that feeling was so familiar. I'd been there. The next day I helped her talk to the police and then go to the court to get a restraining order. It felt so good to do something after so many years of feeling helpless. I was so powerless when I was a kid, and since my friend was in a state of shock and in pain, I took the lead, talking to the people at the court and filling out forms. I was in control. I knew what to do, and it was such a good feeling. The experience with my friend was the first time I felt empowered, and my first experience is assisting someone to become empowered. I knew I wanted to do more. I called the local battered women's agency, which is now Safe Passage, but at the time was called Necessities Necesidades. And there was no shelters back there. It was all a series of hotlines. I'd get a call on the beeper, and I'd find a safe home for them. And I asked them if there was volunteer opportunities, and I was soon in an intensive weeks-long training program. And over the next 4 years, I worked many shifts advocating for women in the court system. In the early 80s, it was a very different time. I had one judge tell me he couldn't grant a restraining order to the woman her husband had attacked and raped because, in the judge's words, you can't rape your wife. Another time, a judge told a woman who was standing before him with a barely recognizable face because she had been beaten so badly that he was postponing his hearing because her abuser had called him and wanted to go on vacation, so he couldn't be there for the hearing. And the judge granted. There are a lot of ways to beat up a woman, and the court system was one of them back then. One of the life-changing things that happened when I worked there was that I worked with a lot of women who were in relationships with women. Before that, I really hadn't realized that was an option. And when I was 22, I began to date women as well. I was in a couple of short relationships and then not great 7-year relationship with a woman who had a childhood as traumatic as my own. And when that relationship ended, a miracle happened. I met my partner of 33 years, who's been my wife for 28 of those years. It feels overly dramatic to describe the beginning of my life with Rita, like that moment in The Wizard of Oz when the movie goes from black and white to everything in shining Technicolor. But forgive me for saying it was exactly like that. And it still is 33 years later. So good news, good stuff. In the same year, another miracle happened, and I got a job at a small program at the time, the Helen Mitchell Family Outreach Project. In 2001, we changed the name to the easier to understand Family Outreach of Amherst. When I got the job, the program had only been established the year before, when a shelter run by the Center for Human Development and housed in the First Congregational Church's parsonage closed. Funding at the state level had changed, leaving the shelter without enough money to operate. They still had money from the town, and the project funded a 30-hour caseworker to assist the families who had moved out of the shelter and into apartments. One of the shelter staff was the first caseworker, and when she left after a year for another position, I was hired. I've been there ever since. It was a very small program back then. I didn't even have my own office or my own phone. This was before cell phones were common. Just a desk and another CHD program, Grace House, that had moved into the parsonage after the shelter closed. As the original 6 families stabilized, or in some cases died, this was during the time of AIDS, I started working with more families. So many of the mothers I worked with had similar childhood stories to my own, and some much, much worse. The common thread of all the folks I worked with was they had a trauma history that had held them back from living the life they once dreamed they would have. Having lived through an awful childhood myself really motivated me to want to provide support that not only helped someone to survive, but to thrive. I started running support groups and then worked with volunteers to start a pre-GED class that helped mothers with life skills like reading the phone book, I was thinking about it. Do you remember the phone book? There used to be a phone book. I sometimes miss the yellow pages because the internet. And also like organizing their bills and things like that. So real life skill stuff that, when you're raised by wolves, you don't get a lot of that. As I started to develop programming, I had a chance meeting with my supervisor. As I was telling him about all the creative programs I wanted to start, he said the 9 words that have become my mantra to this day. You can do anything if you can fund it. That was some powerful words. It was a revelation. I could do anything. I can create anything. I could take my knowledge of what it's like going into the world as a young mother, as a survivor of abuse, and create services for folks that are struggling. That's all I needed to hear. I learned how to write grants. I learned how to develop an advisory board, many of whom have stayed on. The women who raised their hand go from 22 years, down to 2 years, and all in between. I mean, this is a board that has helped grow. When I say that, I mean it. One of your members, I think, is only Louise. Are you the only?
Yes, too.
Oh, you are. Yay!
Well, Megan gave you to speak this talk too.
I know. Yes. So some of our board had.
Well, Evelyn too. She's a member too.
That's right. Evelyn. Yeah. There are other board members here. Wave your hands. When all I've already done it. When all 4 phone lines at the program where I was based were on hold for me, the staff politely suggested I find my own office and my own phone. and I quickly settled into an office on Faring Street that the Gillens own. Yes, Connie's not here, but they've been very supportive of FOA. And through fundraising and a contract with the Department of Children and Families, I was able to hire first one and then another caseworker. And for the last 14 years, we've been right across the street at 401 Main. Today, the program has grown from helping those 6 families settle in to their new apartments to helping over 600 families in many different ways. I am so proud of this journey I have taken with FOA. In many ways, we've grown up together. And while FOA will always be one of the things I am most proud of in my life, it doesn't hold a candle to when I went with my son Chris, the baby I had at 18, to Faneuil Hall in Boston, where he was sworn in as a lawyer in the state of Massachusetts. Okay, if I can get through this paragraph without crying. The ceremony allows the soon-to-be lawyer to pick the person who hands them their certificate, allowing them to practice in Massachusetts. And as we waited in line for our turn, I turned to Chris and said, "This was never supposed to be our story. We were never supposed to be this successful. You, the child of a teen mom, were never supposed to go to UPenn Law. We were never supposed to have such a good life." And he looked at me with his signature grin and said, "You're right, but we did." And we did. And I think a big reason for that was we grew up in Amherst. In fact, we both had Buzz Bray as our high school guidance counselor. And in fact, when this is an aside, but when Chris started getting into some trouble, Buzz was like, I came in concerned to meet with him, and Buzz said, "What are you talking about? What do you remember your childhood?" And I said, "Yes, but Chris is not being raised by my mother. Chris is being raised by me." So, there is something to be said for what not to do, learning what not to do, and just doing the opposite. Amherst supported us. It loved us. It gave us a great education, both of us. Amherst was so different when I was growing up. There was a grocery store in town, a hardware store. There was a men's clothing store. I was just thinking about today called the House of Walsh. Does anyone remember the House of Walsh? We had a thriving downtown with lots of stuff that a human being really needs. And most importantly, we had and still have a gorgeous library, the Jones Library. When I was growing up, I did not want to go home after school. And the Jones Library was a sanctuary for me. It holds a very, very special place in my heart. My life's work has been to help other families grow healthy and strong so they can say they did it, just like Chris and I. I'm retiring in 3 years. I want to spend more time with Chris's daughter, my granddaughter, who's 3, and as well as spend more time in my garden. Memories of the families I've helped can sometimes feel like a kaleidoscope of images. The boy who I drove to a foster home after he finally told someone he was being abused. The little girl who didn't understand why I wouldn't just take her home after I drove her and her mom to a homeless shelter after they were evicted. The client I visited in the ICU after an overdose with tubes coming out of her mouth and nose and who didn't survive. The client who I sat with as her doctor told her she had cancer. And on the images change so many people over so many years, and I'm so grateful that I was there to help them to change their story, because a story can be changed. I'm living proof of it. Thank you. Questions?
Questions from folks?
Or do you all need to just go, whoa, where's the wine?
Take a minute.
Your son is not only a lawyer, but he's a successful musician as well.
That's right. Before he went to law school, he actually went to law school on the late side because he had a 10-year, very successful career as a musician. Had 2 albums, paid his rent.
Your relationship with your dad down on
Yeah.
the Cape, is that it's
Do you know, it's funny because when I actually told my mother about 2 or 3 years ago that that's all I could do. She triggered me too much. It was one of those save myself before and put your own oxygen max on. And she was sort of like, well, what about your father? And I was like, well, he wasn't there, and okay, so yeah, I could start again. Do you want me to start again? But no, it isn't the same because he really left and was isolated, and I know better than to mother blame like it's all her fault. And again, it was a different time. The 70s, it's kind of roles and stuff were different, and I think he saved himself, honestly, which, okay,
Do you ever have therapy?
Lynn, do you think I could have told this story the way I did if I hadn't?
Who hasn't?
Yeah, and I think one of the most powerful things I've done is to name it, name who I am. Yeah.
Or did you have contact with your father during this time when your mother was with the abuser?
Yeah.
Did he know?
How could he not know? He was married to a psychologist. How could he not know? So,
Are
yeah.
your brothers older, younger?
I have a brother who is a year and a half older and a brother who's a year and a half younger. And we all have of our sort of coping strategies. A lot of people have told me I'm the healthiest one, but I was the girl, I was the middle. We all had roles, as we all do. I probably have had the most therapy, but also, I think that resilience, it's a perfect example. We're all very successful. We've all had relationships that are 30 years or more. We've all been very successful and raised delightful children, and so things ooze out, but doesn't it for everyone?
It's such a measure. Right?
Yeah.
How much
You can have
use do you have?
successful relationships
How much use?
and have delightful children.
Exactly. We all came out without any major personality disorders. When? Yes, my dear?
You don't know what I'm gonna say.
Yeah, I don't.
One of the things that I appreciate most about Laura is the way she treats everyone with respect. And every family, every client, and all her staff are so well respected and loved. You know, it's the way you want to be in the world, and
Yeah.
I just find that you mastered that. It's amazing.
Thank you. Thank you.
I had a question about, not personal of nature, the relationship between CHD and the organization.
Yeah.
I
So,
don't know much about that.
yeah, and it can get really confusing. So CHD is sort of the mothership with all the programs below it. So there's one 501c3, which is the charitable organization. It's not like we're not separate, we are a program of the Center for Human Development. They're based in Springfield. And when I started, they probably had 40 programs, and they have like 80 now. It's grown, but of course I've been there 32 years, so what do you think? But yeah, it's grown a lot. It's a really good mix, and I always use this as an example. I also oversee Not Bread Alone, the soup kitchen. And they pretty much leave us alone, they help with budgeting. They're the ones that do the bookkeeping and stuff. We send down all the bills. We don't have to deal with any of that, they have payroll. But a volunteer slipped and broke her elbow on like a grape or something. And all I had to do as the, director, though, Bob Stover is the one that does everything, is give the woman a name and number. And she called and they dealt with everything. So it's that kind of thing, certainly there are times when they say, oh, you have to do things this way, and I grumble and mumble and gnash my teeth, but for the most part, it is a good relationship because of all of that. Yeah. And yes?
Two questions. One, if I understood you, you said your father did help you support you financially.
Yeah.
When you moved into your apartment.
Yeah.
He did that.
Yeah.
Was your mother a teen? Was your mother a teen mother?
Well, my father was an English teacher at Frontier Regional High School, and she was his student. And they got married when she was 17. She had her first child when she was 20, and by 23 she had 3. So, I could also tell you why this happened, and she absolutely has a story, and I understand that story. Maybe that's one of the reasons why but I've also have come to understand that doesn't change what happened in my childhood. And so she moved near where I lived and was there for about 1.5 years, and that was after that time. She would just keep saying really stupid stuff about, oh yeah, I loved living in that house. Oh, you mean the house where you encouraged the relationship when I was 14 and the guy was 36? That house? So, I could lose it, Well, I kind of did in the driveway one day. And that's when I drove away, and then I texted her, actually. Thank God for text, and just said, yeah, I can't do, this is too triggering for me. I can talk to you if the only thing we talk about is exactly what is happening today. So, yeah.
I was just wondering if your mom had any resources that she sought out when she was going through the abuse.
I don't think so.
No.
I don't.
Or did she try, or anything like that?
Well, here's the part. Yeah, no, she didn't.
Okay.
It's again, so many of your questions. Yeah, okay. I could sit down 2 hours later. You know the whole story. But the other thing is that, my dad had resources. And this is one thing that I want to say that I've really come to realize, is that my story of success and resiliency has a lot to do with the fact that I had educated parents. I had a father with resources. My mother was, for everything, was in her own way very loving and caring and smart and creative, which helps. And I grew up in a white middle class family no matter what was going on. And so when I first came to FOA, I said to a lot of black and brown clients, if I can do it, you can do it, in a very insensitive way, that I've come to realize, what the hell are you talking about, Laura? You know, their story is in fact really different, and a lot of it has to do with racism and their experience. And Francine Rodriguez, who's brown, who's our program manager, I for years spouted drivel about how it was so easy to change your life, and she would just go. And then, you know, thank God, you know, so sadly, because of the George Floyd murder, we started having so many more dialogues around this and started talking about this. And I sat down with Francine and deeply, deeply apologized, because I had started, you know, learning and reading, and, you know, yeah, she was like, yeah, that sucked. So, you know, and you know, it speaks to how strong our relationship is, was that she was grateful for the apology and is more likely, although not as much as I'd like, for her to call me out on stuff. But I certainly try to do, you know, better.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Maybe a little bit of an amorphous question. So, in your transformation from victim to champion, how did you know you reached this, like, piercing through society's vision of you as a victim and was able to accept you into the ranks of champion? You know what I mean? Like,
I think, you know, there is a sort of amount of kind of fake it till you make it kind of thing, you know, like I had this, I don't think it could happen the way it happened now, the way it happened then, where I was a caseworker, I was given so much autonomy to create something. I then had the right people come into my life that could help me build that. And so, you know, if you are being shown that you're being successful, that's huge for your self-esteem. You know, I think I actually had a lot of bravado. I had to have a lot of bravado back then. I think I'm actually a lot more sort of humble and less willing to say I'm a champion now, you know, because 62 years, you know, you just learn stuff and it's just like, shut up and just listen, you know what I mean? But also age just, you know, is a huge gift, right? I mean, I don't know if other people feel this way, but I'm just so much more willing to just simply be who I am now than I was, you know, 20 years ago. So I don't know if I answered your question. Was that your question? Did I answer it?
yeah, I feel like that's touching on it, yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Shall we take like one or more? Another question? And then
Do you have a comment?
I did. I mean, I was sort of curious, you know, those 9 fateful words or
Yeah.
whatever, inspiring words, like, if
Yeah.
you know, you can do anything if you can raise the funds, basically. So that was life-changing for you, but I'm curious about, you know, as a young caseworker working in this agency with your little desk embedded among
Yeah.
this other agency, you know, what you did with, like, sort of operationally, how you sort of thought about it and said, okay,
Yeah.
good, I'm gonna go raise money,
Yeah.
which is a hard thing to do.
Yeah, I didn't know that. Do you know, I mean, I think that's really, you're much better off not knowing. You know, it's like people will say to me, oh, we'd love to sit down and consult with you. We'd love to replicate what, you know, it's like, it's not replicable. You know, you know, find a young person with nothing to lose and just have them steamroll themselves into, and I did, and again, this is a legacy of my mother of like, if you don't know something, find out, take classes in grant writing, I was at a meeting and Betsy, I didn't know Betsy yet, and she was speaking up about this collaboration we were having with Rotary, and she just started asking all these questions, and it's like, we need to do this, and we don't, and how are we going to do this? And I thought, I need to know that woman, So, I'm not gonna say I'm not smart, because I think, you know what I mean. But it's a bravado, and yeah. Boy, I lucked out. Maybe I had used up all my coins of a crappy childhood, into my 20s, and because it did. It just like went.
Cash in.
It just cashed in, and Technicolor went on. Oh, sorry.
Over the
One more?
30 years that you've been doing this,
Yeah.
you've seen the attitude of society and courts and lawyers and judges change.
I've seen so many things change, and I would say domestic. Yeah, and well, in some ways, actually. When I first started as a caseworker, benefits, like, welfare benefits, when if a mother, say a boyfriend abandons, her and she has a new baby, it was an entitlement back then for you to get support. It was called TFDC, and it was, transitional support. And you were allowed to go to college. You can't go to college now if you're receiving benefits. I could go to community college. I had a subsidized childcare slot. I was allowed to move out of poverty. It's not really possible anymore. Safe Passage closed their shelter. They closed their shelter. They closed their shelter because they couldn't house women and get more in because the housing crisis is so bad. So they had women there who were literally raising their children in the shelter because there was no housing, no affordable housing. So a lot of things have gotten much worse. I mean, the housing crisis is absolutely out of control. You can get a Section 8 certificate, which is supposed to allow you to pay an affordable rate, but you have to be under a certain, a range of the apartment, how much it costs. There's no apartments in this area that fall under that range. They're all too expensive. So that's not why I'm retiring, but I will be happy to see that go, because a lot of people's lives are so much harder than they certainly were when I was a young mom, which I feel really bad about. And the immigrant bashing, we work with a lot of immigrants because we have caseworkers who speak Spanish, and you will never meet anyone who is more hardworking, ever. They always have two jobs, And so when I hear, oh, lazy, or oh, they're taking jobs, give me a break. You're not going to be cleaning the toilets and then going, in the middle of COVID to do the laundry of nursing homes that were just rife with it. I mean, so, I got on my high horse there. Let me get off. Okay. All right. Do you want to?
Thank you very much for sharing your brave person to stand up there and
Oh,
tell your story.
well,
Really appreciate it.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
You're welcome. And I feel like our town is really, really lucky to have someone like you. You
Thank
really
you.
make a difference.
Thank you.
So on behalf of the club, there's a little.
Oh, look at that. Thank you.
You mentioned you like gardening.
Yes,
And
it will be alive.
And you also get a membership to the.
Oh, neat. Oh, that's great. I saw a luncheon, an invite for a luncheon. I thought to myself, well, I don't think I can go to that.
So thank you very much. Thank you all for coming out, and thank you for supporting the series over the year. This is our last one, and hopefully we'll start up again next year. If anybody has any thoughts or suggestions for some remarkable women to have, please share them, and please show up.
I would love to see one of their outreach workers speak.
Oh, they don't like doing that.
Iris
Iris.
is amazing.
Yeah, we can be in
Stories.
contact about that, but yeah, if anybody has suggestions, and please continue to show up. It's been a really great year, and thank you, Maggie, also.